If you can't ask your wife to leave, then you're no longer my son." Those words were spoken by the very mother-in-law she respected as she gave an order to her own son. They say a seed cannot sprout on stone. In the perfectly manicured yet lifeless garden of a great family, Amara was like a strange flower, an herb carrying the fragrance of freedom, and the powerful gardener decided to uproot it. But they didn't know that when cast out onto the soil of life, that seed doesn't die. It finds its own earth, soaks in its own light, and grows into a forest that no wall can contain. Have you ever felt like a strange flower in a garden that wasn't yours? Share your feelings with us. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to witness Amara's journey of blossoming. The chandelier glittered like a frozen cascade, casting prisms across the dining hall of the Warrington estate. Silver cutlery gleamed on a table draped in crisp white linen, each napkin folded with geometric precision, as if even the fabric dared not defy Elizabeth Warrington's will. The air carried the faint scent of lilies, arranged in towering centerpieces that stood like sentinels over the evening's meticulously planned perfection. Tonight, Elizabeth, chairwoman of the Warrington Financial Empire, was hosting her annual dinner for business partners, a showcase of wealth, influence, and control. Every detail, from the polished marble floors to the soft hum of a string quartet, was a testament to her dominion. But as Santa stood at the edge of the room, a tray of her passion fruit ginger hibiscus cheesecakes in hand, she felt the weight of eyes, none heavier than Elizabeth's. Sanaa moved forward, her steps measured, the low bun of her hair a quiet rebellion against the opulence around her. She had spent hours in the kitchen, blending flavors from her African heritage with bold, unexpected twists, crafting a dessert she hoped would speak louder than words. The guests, a parade of tailored suits and shimmering gowns, murmured politely as she placed the tray on the table. Elizabeth rose from her seat at the head, her wine-red dress catching the light like a warning. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth as velvet but sharp as a blade, "allow me to introduce Sanaa, James's wife. She has a unique passion for cooking." The word unique hung in the air, laced with condescension, as if Sanaa's craft were a child's hobby rather than a calling. The guests smiled, some nodding, others exchanging glances. Sanaa's lips curved into a practiced smile, but her eyes flickered with something unspoken. "Sanaa's prepared a little treat for us tonight," Elizabeth continued, her gaze locking onto Sanaa's. "Something unconventional, I'm sure." The room chuckled softly, the sound grating against Sanaa's nerves. She caught James's eye across the table, hoping for a spark of support. He offered a faint smile, his fingers drumming lightly on his glass, a nervous habit she'd once found endearing. Now it felt like a retreat. She straightened, refusing to shrink, and began serving the cheesecakes, each slice a vibrant swirl of creamy white and sunset orange, fragrant with ginger and hibiscus. The first guest, a silver-haired investor, took a bite and gasped, his fork pausing midair. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying across the table. "The flavors, bold yet harmonious. Where did you learn this?" Sanaa's smile warmed, genuine now. "It's a story in every bite," she said softly. "A little from my roots, a little from the world I've explored." More guests tasted, their murmurs turning to praise. A woman in pearls leaned forward, her eyes bright. "It's like nothing I've ever had. You must share the recipe." Sanaa nodded, her heart swelling, but the moment was cut short. Elizabeth's laugh, sharp and deliberate, sliced through the chatter. "How charming," she said, her glass raised as if toasting. "Sana does have a flair for the exotic." The word landed like a stone, and the room's warmth cooled. Sana's hand tightened around the serving spatula, but she kept her composure, her voice steady. "I hope it brings you joy," she said to the guests, her words a quiet defiance. As the dinner progressed, Elizabeth steered the conversation to mergers and market shares, her domain of absolute control. Sanaya sat beside James, her plate barely touched, the weight of Elizabeth's gaze pressing against her. Every now and then, Elizabeth would toss a veiled remark her way. "Sanaa, you must find our little gatherings so different from your culinary circles," she said, her smile tight. Sanaya met her eyes, refusing to flinch. I find them inspiring, she replied, her tone polite but firm. Every table tells a story. Elizabeth's lips twitched, a flicker of irritation betraying her poised facade. James shifted in his seat, his hand brushing Sana's under the table, a silent plea to let it go. She squeezed back, but not in surrender. She was reading the room, learning its rules, and sensing the battle lines being drawn. The evening wore on, plates cleared, and the quartet played its final notes. Guests rose, offering compliments to Elizabeth on the flawless event. A few lingered near Sana, pressing for details about her dessert. You must open a restaurant, one said, slipping her a business card. Sana thanked them, her heart racing with possibility, but Elizabeth's shadow loomed nearby. As the last guest departed, Elizabeth approached, her heels clicking on the marble. You made quite an impression, she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. But this family thrives on order, Sana. Spontaneity doesn't suit us. Sanaa held her gaze, her response calm but unyielding. I only wanted to share something meaningful. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, a silent warning, before she turned away, her silhouette disappearing into the hall. James caught Sana's arm as they headed upstairs, his voice hushed. Mother just wants everything perfect, Sana. She doesn't mean to offend. Sana stopped, turning to face him. His eyes, usually so warm, were clouded with unease. James, she said softly, perfection isn't control, it's connection. He looked away, his fingers brushing his chin, and in that moment, Sana saw the fracture beneath his charm, a man torn between love and loyalty. As they reached their room, the weight of the evening settled between them, unspoken but heavy. Sana knew this was no mere dinner party. It was Elizabeth's stage, and she had just stepped onto it, uninvited, with a tray of cheesecake and a spark that refused to dim. The night was over, but the story that began was far from finished. The echo of Elizabeth's parting words from the dinner party lingered in Sanaa's mind like a bitter aftertaste. Spontaneity doesn't suit us, she had said, her voice a velvet glove over an iron fist. Sanaa lay awake that night, the memory of James's hesitant grip on her hand gnawing at her. The mansion, with its polished surfaces and silent corridors, felt less like a home and more like a stage where only Elizabeth's script was allowed. By morning, Sana resolved to find a corner of this world to call her own, a place where her voice, her flavors, could breathe. The kitchen, she decided, would be her sanctuary. She descended the grand staircase, the dawn light filtering through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscope patterns on the marble. The kitchen was a fortress of stainless steel, gleaming like a laboratory, its sterile order a testament to Elizabeth's reign. The French chef, Pierre, moved with mechanical precision, preparing a breakfast menu dictated by Elizabeth's handwritten notes. Sanaa hesitated at the threshold, her fingers brushing the edge of her apron. Mind if I help? She asked, her voice steady but warm. Pierre glanced up, his brow furrowing. Madame Elizabeth prefers her routine, he said, his accent clipped. Sanaa smiled undeterred. Just a small dish, for James. Pierre shrugged, stepping aside, but his eyes followed her like a guard. Sanaa reached for a pan, her movements fluid, almost defiant, as she began a simple frittata infused with lemongrass and chili flavors James had once savored during their courtship. The aroma filled the kitchen, a quiet rebellion against the bland omelets on Pierre's menu. For a moment she felt alive, the sizzle of the pan a song she hadn't sung in weeks. But the moment was shattered when Elizabeth's voice cut through the air. What's that smell? She stood in the doorway, her silk robe immaculate, her gaze slicing through the steam. Sana turned, spatula in hand. A frittata for James, something to brighten his morning. Elizabeth's lips pressed into a thin line. We don't do surprises in this kitchen, Sana. Pierre knows what's expected. Sana held her ground, her tone even. I thought a little variety might be welcome. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, turning away with a dismissive wave. The rebuff stung, but Sana refused to let it fester. That afternoon, she wandered the estate's sprawling grounds, seeking a space less suffocated by Elizabeth's rules. Behind the manicured hedges, she found it, a forgotten patch of earth, overgrown with weeds hidden by an old oak. It was small, unremarkable, but to Sana, it was a canvas. Over the next days, she poured her heart into it, planting mint, lemongrass, and African basil, each root a piece of her soul. She tended it in the early mornings, her hands caked with soil, the scent of herbs a balm against the mansion's cold perfection. The garden became her refuge, a place where she could dream of dishes that told stories, dishes that healed. One morning as the sun crested the horizon, Sana stepped outside, a watering can in hand, only to freeze. Her garden was gone. The vibrant rows of herbs had been raised, replaced by a sterile lawn, its green so uniform it seemed to mock her. Her chest tightened, as if the air itself had been stolen. She knelt, her fingers brushing the bare soil, searching for a trace of her basil, her mint, her hope. A shadow fell over her. Elizabeth stood by the window, a teacup cradled in her hands, her expression serene but unyielding. Sana rose, her voice trembling but clear. "Why?" Elizabeth's reply was calm, almost bored. "This estate demands harmony, Sana. Those weeds disrupted the balance. We're not running a market stall." The words cut deeper than any blade, each syllable a reminder of Sana's place, or lack thereof, in this house. Sana's eyes burned, but she refused to let tears fall. She turned to James that evening, finding him in the study, his head buried in financial reports. "Your mother destroyed my garden," she said, her voice low but urgent. "It was just a small patch, James. My own space." He looked up, his fingers pausing on his laptop, his face a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "Mother just wants the estate to look its best," he said, his words a tired echo of the dinner party. "It's not personal." Sana's heart sank, not at the loss of the garden, but at the realization that James's love came with a leash. "It's personal to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back, her resolve hardening like clay in a kiln. As she climbed the stairs to their room, the mansion's silence felt heavier, its walls closing in. The garden's destruction wasn't just about herbs. It was a message, a line drawn in the dirt. Elizabeth wasn't just controlling the estate. She was controlling Sana's place in it, erasing her bit by bit. But Sana wasn't one to crumble. The bitterness of that barren lawn ignited something within her, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. She didn't yet know how, but she would find a way to reclaim her voice, to plant her roots where no one could uproot them. The kitchen was closed to her, the garden gone, but her dreams were still hers, and they were far from finished. The scent of uprooted basil still clung to Sana's hands, a ghost of the garden Elizabeth had erased with a single command. The sting of that loss pulsed through her as she sat at the dining table, the mansion's grandeur a cold cage around her heart. The raised lawn outside was a silent taunt, a reminder that her place in this house was as fragile as the herbs she'd planted. But Sana was no stranger to rebuilding. If Elizabeth thought she could snuff out her spirit with a landscaper's blade, she was mistaken. That night, as the mansion slept under its heavy silence, Sana pored over her savings, her laptop glowing with listings for a small storefront downtown. She would cook, not in Elizabeth's sterile kitchen, but on her own terms, in a space where her flavors could sing. By morning, she'd found it, a modest corner shop with peeling paint and a cracked window, but enough heart to hold her vision. She leased it with every naira she'd saved, her hands trembling as she signed the contract. This wasn't just a business. It was a declaration. The pop-up restaurant, Sana's Kitchen, would open on weekends, serving fusion dishes that wove her African heritage with the city's pulse. She spent days scrubbing the space, hanging string lights and painting the walls a warm ochre, each stroke a step toward reclaiming her voice. As she worked, she imagined the tables filled with strangers sharing stories over her food, a community bound by flavor, not control. That evening, the dining room was a battlefield disguised in candlelight. Elizabeth sat at the head, her ruby ring glinting as she sliced her steak with surgical precision. James sat across from Sanya, his eyes darting between his wife and mother, sensing the storm brewing. Sana took a breath, her voice steady but bright with purpose. "I've leased a storefront," she announced, setting down her fork. "I'm opening a pop-up restaurant this weekend. Small, but it's mine." James's face lit up, a flicker of pride breaking through his usual caution. "That's incredible, Sana," he said, his smile hesitant but genuine. "What kind of food?" She leaned forward, her passion spilling out. "Fusion. Bold, healing flavors. Think jollof rice with a twist of citrus, or plantain fritters with a chili lime glaze. Food that tells a story." Elizabeth's fork paused midair, her silence sharper than any rebuke. The room seemed to hold its breath, the clink of crystal glasses fading into the background. "A pop-up," she said at last, her voice smooth but laced with frost. "How charmingly simplistic." The words landed like a slap, but Sana kept her gaze steady. "It's not about scale," she replied. "It's about connection. People need that more than grandeur." Elizabeth's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Connection is a luxury, Sana. This family's legacy is built on influence, not street food." The table fell silent, the air thick with her dismissal. James shifted, his fingers brushing his chin, but he said nothing, his silence a heavier blow than Elizabeth's words. Sana's heart twisted, but she pressed on. "I'd love for you to come, James," she said, her eyes searching his. "See what I'm building." He nodded, but his glance at Elizabeth betrayed his conflict. Elizabeth set her napkin down, her movements deliberate. "Sana, dear, our family has a charity gala coming up. I need someone to lead the foundation's efforts, someone with poise, someone who understands our stature. That role would suit you far better than this venture." Her offer was a gilded cage, a calculated move to clip Sana's wings. Sana's smile was polite but firm. "I appreciate the offer, Elizabeth, but my kitchen is where I belong." Elizabeth's eyes flashed, a spark of irritation breaking her composure. But she said nothing more, her silence a promise of retribution. As the dinner ended, Sana cleared her plate, her resolve unshaken. Later, in the quiet of the hallway, Mr. Thompson caught her eye, his presence a rare comfort in the mansion's chill. "I know a critic who'd love your work," he said softly, slipping her a business card. "Don't let the noise drown you out." His words were a lifeline, a reminder that someone saw her fire. Sana tucked the card into her pocket, her heart steadying. She returned to her room where James sat on the bed, his laptop open, but his eyes distant. "You could have backed me up," she said, her voice low but piercing. He looked up, guilt etching his features. "I'm proud of you, Sana. Mother's got a vision for us." Sana shook her head, her disappointment sharper than anger. "Your mother's vision isn't ours, James. Mine is." As she lay awake that night, the critic's card a weight in her hand, Sana felt the spark of her dream flare brighter. Elizabeth's mockery had only fueled her. The pop-up would open, and it would be more than a restaurant. It would be her rebellion, her sanctuary, her voice. But she knew the cost was rising. Elizabeth's gilded offer was no gift. It was a trap, and James's silence was a crack in their foundation. The weekend loomed, a test of her courage, and Sana was ready to face it, even if it meant standing alone. The glow of Sana's triumph at her pop-up restaurant lingered like the aftertaste of her chili lime plantain fritters, but it was a victory tinged with unease. The weekend opening of Sana's kitchen had been a quiet revolution. Tables packed with strangers laughing over plates of jollof rice kissed with citrus, their stories mingling with the clink of forks. Mr. Thompson's critic contact had delivered beyond expectation, and now a glossy magazine sat on the mansion's coffee table, its headline screaming, "Sana's Hidden Gem, Healing Through Cuisine." The article praised her fusion dishes as a love letter to community, a beacon in a city starved for authenticity. Sana had held the magazine in her hands that morning, her heart swelling with pride, but the weight of Elizabeth's silence loomed larger. She knew this wasn't just praise, it was a gauntlet thrown at the feet of a woman who thrived on control. The living room of the Warrington estate was a study in elegance, its velvet drapes and mahogany furniture a backdrop to the storm brewing within. Elizabeth stood by the fireplace, the magazine in her hand, her ruby ring catching the light as she turned the pages with deliberate slowness. Sanaya sat on the edge of a leather sofa, her fingers clasped tightly, sensing the air grow heavy. James stood near the window, his shoulders tense, his eyes flicking between his wife and mother like a man caught in a riptide. The silence stretched, taut as a wire, until Elizabeth spoke, her voice low and sharp as a blade. "This," she said, holding up the magazine, "is a spectacle, Sana, a public defiance of everything this family stands for." Her words sliced through the room, each one a calculated strike. "You've turned our name into a sideshow." Sana's breath caught, but she met Elizabeth's gaze, her voice steady. "It's my name too, Elizabeth, and it's not defiance, it's my work, my purpose." Elizabeth's lips curled, not into a smile but a grimace of disdain. "Purpose? This family's purpose is legacy, not peddling street food to strangers." Sana leaned forward, her resolve unshaken. "Food builds bridges, not walls. I'm not tearing anything down. I'm creating." The room seemed to shrink, the tension coiling tighter. James shifted, his hand brushing his chin, but he remained silent, his hesitation a louder betrayal than any words. Elizabeth set the magazine down with a soft thud, her eyes never leaving Sana. "You mistake indulgence for freedom," she said, her tone icy. "This family has a reputation, a stature. Your little venture undermines it." She turned to James, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If you can't ask your wife to abandon this absurd idea and leave this house, you're no longer my son." The ultimatum landed like a thunderclap, the air itself seeming to crack. James froze, his face paling, his fingers curling into fists. Sana's heart pounded, but she kept her eyes on Elizabeth, refusing to flinch. The room was a battlefield now, and James was its reluctant soldier. "Mother, please," James began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can't we find a middle ground?" Elizabeth's gaze hardened, her ring glinting as she pointed at him. "There is no middle ground when your wife parades our name in some rag and calls it art." She stepped closer, her presence towering. "Choose, James, your legacy or her pride." Sana's chest tightened, not at Elizabeth's words, but at the silence that followed. She turned to James, searching his face for the man who'd once promised to stand by her. His eyes met hers, pained and pleading, but his mouth stayed closed, his fear of losing his mother's approval, a trust fund, a title, chaining him to the spot. "James," Sana said softly, her voice cutting through the silence, "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to see me." He opened his mouth, then closed it, his hand rising to his chin again. "Sana, just pause this, for now. For the family," he said, his words faltering under Elizabeth's watchful eye. Sana's heart sank, not from surprise, but from the weight of his surrender. She stood, her movements deliberate, her voice calm but unyielding. "I won't pause who I am, James. Not for her, and not for a family that demands I disappear." Elizabeth's lips twitched, a flicker of triumph. But Sana's eyes held no defeat, only clarity. She turned and walked toward the staircase, each step a quiet rebellion. James called after her, his voice cracking. "Sana, wait." But she didn't stop. The magazine lay on the table, its headline a beacon of her truth, and Mr. Thompson's card burned in her pocket, a reminder that her fight wasn't over. Upstairs, she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands steady despite the storm within. Elizabeth's ultimatum was a line in the sand, and James's silence was a choice. Sana knew what came next wasn't just about leaving, it was about reclaiming. The pop-up was only the beginning, and no one, not even Elizabeth, could uproot her now. The echo of Elizabeth's ultimatum hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, as Sana climbed the staircase of the Warrington mansion. "If you can't ask your wife to abandon this absurd idea and leave, you're no longer my son." The words had struck like a gavel, in James's silence, his faltering plea for Sana to pause her dreams had been a deeper wound. She reached the bedroom, the door clicking shut behind her, sealing her in a space that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage for her final act in this house. The magazine article, her triumph at Sana's kitchen, lay discarded downstairs, its glow dimmed by the reality of James's choice. But Sana was not one to break. If this was the end, she would leave on her own terms, with her dignity intact. The room was pristine, its silk drapes and polished furniture a mockery of the chaos within her. Sana moved to the wardrobe, her hands steady as she pulled out a small suitcase. Its leather worn but sturdy, a relic from her days before the mansion's gilded cage. She folded her clothes with care, each blouse, each skirt a piece of herself she refused to let Elizabeth erase. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric and the distant hum of the mansion's air conditioning. She paused at a scarf, vibrant red with gold threads, a gift from a friend who'd believed in her culinary dreams. Wrapping it around her wrist, she felt its warmth anchor her, a reminder of the fire Elizabeth couldn't extinguish. Downstairs, James stood frozen by the window, his fingers tracing his chin, his eyes fixed on the sterile lawn where Sanaa's garden once bloomed. Elizabeth sat in her armchair, her ruby ring glinting as she sipped tea, her posture radiating triumph. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "This family needs unity, not rebellion." James's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond, his heart a tangle of guilt and fear. The trust fund, the vice presidency, the weight of his mother's legacy, they were chains he couldn't break, not yet. But Sanaa's words, "I'm asking you to see me," echoed in his mind, each syllable a mirror to his cowardice. Sanaa descended the staircase, the suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The sound drew James's gaze, his face paling as he saw her resolve. She stopped at the marble table in the foyer, its surface cold under her fingers. With deliberate care, she set down her house keys and wedding ring, the metal clinking softly, a sound that cut through the room like a bell. Elizabeth rose, her eyes narrowing, but Sanaa spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering. "James," she said, turning to him, "I'm not leaving because your mother demanded it. I'm leaving because you couldn't defend even a corner of this home for me. If you can't protect my dreams, how can I trust you with my life?" James stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Sanaa, please. Just give me time. We can work this out." His eyes were desperate, but his hands stayed at his sides, his mother's presence a shadow over his shoulder. Sanaa shook her head, her gaze steady but not cruel. "Time doesn't fix silence, James. You chose her control over our love." Elizabeth's lips twitched, a flicker of satisfaction, but Sanaa's eyes held no defeat, only clarity. She turned to the door, her steps measured, her heels clicking softly on the marble, each one a declaration of her freedom. As she reached the threshold, Mr. Thompson appeared in the hallway, his presence quiet but steady. He caught her eye, his nod subtle but weighted with understanding. "You're stronger than this house," he said softly, his words a lifeline she tucked into her heart. Sanaa offered a small smile, then stepped outside, the evening air cool against her skin. The mansion loomed behind her, its grandeur a hollow shell. She walked past the manicured hedges, past the lawn that had swallowed her garden, her suitcase a steady companion. Elizabeth watched from the window, her silhouette rigid, believing she'd won. But Sanaa's calm was not surrender. It was preparation. She reached the street, the city's hum a distant promise. Her phone buzzed, a text from James. "I'm sorry, I didn't want this." She stared at the screen, then turned it off, sliding it into her pocket. The critic's card from Thompson, still tucked there, felt like a seed waiting to grow. Sanaa hailed a cab, giving the driver the address of a modest studio apartment she'd leased months ago, a precaution she hadn't wanted to need. As the car pulled away, the mansion shrank in the rearview mirror, its lights fading. Sanaa's hands tightened in her lap, not with fear but with purpose. She wasn't just leaving a house, she was reclaiming her life. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers, and she would build something no one could uproot. The cab's taillights faded into the city's pulse, carrying Sanaa away from the Warrington mansion and its suffocating silence. The weight of her suitcase, the clink of her wedding ring left on the marble table, and James's desperate text, "I'm sorry, I didn't want this," still lingered, but Sanaa's heart was steady. She hadn't left to lose, she'd left to reclaim. The studio apartment she'd leased months ago, a quiet precaution tucked in her back pocket, was no palace. Its cracked linoleum floors and single window overlooking a noisy street were a far cry from the mansion's polished grandeur. But as Sanaa stepped inside, the air felt lighter, unburdened by Elizabeth's shadow. This was her space, and it tasted like freedom. She wasted no time. With her remaining savings, Sana transformed the modest storefront from her pop-up into Sana's Kitchen, a permanent community hub. By day, she served vibrant lunch bowls, jollof rice with mango salsa, grilled yams with rosemary-infused oil, each dish a story of her roots and her resilience. By night, she offered free cooking classes to the city's underserved, teaching single mothers and young dreamers to blend spices with hope. The space buzzed with life, mismatched tables crowded with strangers, laughter mingling with the sizzle of pans, and the scent of lemongrass weaving through the air like a promise. Sanaa moved through it all, her apron dusted with flour, her hands steady as she plated dishes that healed more than hunger. Word spread fast. A local food blogger posted about her jerk-spice plantain fritters, and soon Sana's Kitchen was a social media beacon, its hashtag trending among the city's foodies. But not every door opened easily. One afternoon, a well-dressed restaurateur visited, his brow furrowed as he scanned the menu. "Interesting flavors," he said, his tone skeptical, "but they're a bit unconventional for our clientele." Sanaa's smile didn't waver. "Try this," she said, sliding a plate of her chili lime-glazed chicken across the counter. He took a bite, his eyes widening, then softening. "This is remarkable," he admitted, scribbling a note to book her for a catering gig. Sanaa nodded, her heart swelling not with pride, but with proof her food could change minds, even those hardened by doubt. Back at the mansion, the absence of Sanaa's warmth was a silent ache. James sat at the dining table staring at a plate of perfectly cooked eggs, their precision a hollow echo of Elizabeth's control. The meals were flawless, as always, but they lacked the soul of Sanaa's cooking, the way she'd hum softly while stirring a pot, or the way her dishes carried stories he hadn't realized he'd miss. Elizabeth sat across from him, flipping through a financial report, her voice crisp. "You're better off, James. Focus on the company now." But her words felt empty, and James's fingers brushed his chin, his guilt a weight he couldn't shake. The mansion's polished surfaces reflected nothing but absence, and he began to see the cost of his silence. One evening, Sana stood at the stove in her kitchen, teaching a group of teenagers to make a goosey stew, their laughter filling the room. A notification pinged on her phone. A bank deposit, her biggest yet, from a catering job for a local gallery opening. She paused, the numbers a quiet victory, each naira earned by her hands, her vision. The critic's card from Mr. Thompson, still tucked in her pocket, had been her first step. But this was her leap. She wasn't just surviving, she was building something unbreakable. As she stirred the stew, a young girl asked, "How do you keep going when it's hard?" Sana's eyes softened. "You find what makes you feel alive," she said, "and you hold on to it, no matter who tries to take it away." Across town, James walked through the mansion's silent halls, the sterile lawn outside a reminder of Sania's uprooted garden. He scrolled through his phone, landing on a photo of her pop-up's opening night, her smile radiant as she served a crowd. His chest tightened, not with jealousy but with regret. Elizabeth's voice broke his thoughts, calling from the study. "James, we need to review the gala budget." He nodded, but his steps were heavy, each one a reminder of the life he'd let slip away. The mansion was perfect, but it was a tomb, and Sana's absence was its loudest echo. Sana closed Sana's Kitchen late that night, the last customer leaving with a smile and a takeout box. She stood alone in the dim light, the scent of spices lingering, her heart full. The road ahead was hers, paved with every dish she'd served, every story she'd told. Elizabeth's ultimatum had meant to break her, but it had set her free. As she locked the door, her phone buzzed. Another text from James. "I miss you." She read it, then slipped the phone into her pocket, her gaze fixed on the city's lights. Freedom tasted like chili and lime, like laughter and late nights, and Sana was ready to savor every bite. The scent of chili and lime from Sana's Kitchen still lingered in her memory, a reminder of the freedom she'd carved from the ashes of Elizabeth's ultimatum. Months had passed since she'd walked away from the Warrington mansion, her suitcase a testament to her dignity. And in that time, Sanaa's Kitchen had become a beacon. Its tables overflowed with laughter, its walls hummed with stories, and its dishes, bold, healing blends of her African heritage and the city's heartbeat, drew crowds that spilled onto the street. Sanaa had built more than a restaurant. She'd built a community. But the past was never far behind. And tonight, it called her back to the mansion's gilded cage for Elizabeth's annual charity gala, a stage where control was currency and Sana was an unexpected guest. The crisis had struck like lightning. Elizabeth's celebrity chef, a cornerstone of the gala's prestige, had canceled after a car accident, leaving her meticulously planned event teetering on collapse. The news sent ripples through the Warrington estate, where perfection was non-negotiable. In the boardroom, Elizabeth's voice was clipped, her fingers twisting her ruby ring as she barked orders at staff. Mr. Thompson, ever calm, leaned forward, his tone deliberate. "There's one person who can save this, Elizabeth. Sana's kitchen is the talk of the city. Her food tells a story your donors will eat up. Literally." Elizabeth's eyes flashed, but the stakes were too high. To save face, she agreed, her consent a bitter pill swallowed for the sake of her legacy. Sana arrived at the mansion's ballroom, her team trailing with crates of spices and fresh herbs. The space was a cathedral of opulence, crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed tables, and a sea of expectant faces in tailored suits and shimmering gowns. Sanaa moved with quiet confidence, her apron a badge of her authority, her low bun a nod to her resolve. She transformed the sterile banquet into a tapestry of flavor, platters of egusi-stuffed dumplings, skewers of tamarind-glazed chicken, and bowls of jollof rice kissed with hibiscus. Each dish was a story, a thread of her heritage woven into the city's fabric. The guests, initially skeptical, leaned in, their murmurs turning to gasps of delight. "This is divine," a donor whispered, her fork hovering over a dumpling. "It's like a memory I didn't know I had." Sana stepped to the podium, her voice clear and steady, commanding the room. "Every dish tonight is a seed," she said, her words carrying the weight of her journey. "Some call them weeds, but they bloom where they're planted, building bridges where walls once stood." The room fell silent, her subtle nod to the raised garden striking a chord. Elizabeth, seated at the head table, stiffened, her smile a mask of control. James, standing at the edge of the crowd, watched Sana, his heart a knot of awe and regret. Her presence wasn't just a performance, it was a reckoning, a light that exposed the cracks in the mansion's facade. As the evening unfolded, guests swarmed Sana, their praise drowning out the string quartet. A philanthropist pressed for her catering contacts. A journalist scribbled notes for a feature. Sana answered each with grace, her eyes bright with purpose. But Elizabeth's gaze burned from across the room, her silence a storm waiting to break. During a lull, she approached, her voice low and sharp. "You've made your point, Sana, but don't mistake applause for belonging." Sana met her eyes, unflinching. "I'm not here to belong, Elizabeth. I'm here to create." The words hung between them, a quiet challenge that left Elizabeth's lips pressed thin. James lingered nearby, his fingers brushing his chin, his eyes locked on Sana. He wanted to speak, to bridge the chasm his silence had carved, but the weight of his mother's presence held him back. Sana caught his gaze, her expression not angry but resolute, a woman who'd found her strength beyond his reach. As she directed her team to serve the final course, a hibiscus sorbet that left guests breathless, she felt the room shift. This wasn't Elizabeth's stage anymore. It was hers, built not on control but on authenticity. The gala ended with a standing ovation, not for Elizabeth's charity, but for Sana's vision. Donors pledged thousands, inspired by her story of food as healing. Sana packed her crates, her team's laughter a stark contrast to the mansion's sterile air. As she stepped toward the exit, Thompson caught her arm, his nod warm. "You've changed the game," he said softly. Sana smiled, her heart full but steady. She'd come not to win but to stand, and stand she did. The mansion loomed behind her, but its shadow no longer reached her. The night had been a feast of truth, and Sana knew the final reckoning was near. The applause from the gala still echoed in Sana's ears as she stepped out of the Warrington Mansion's ballroom. The night air sharp with the promise of a new dawn. Her triumph, dishes that wove stories, a speech that silenced doubters, had turned Elizabeth's stage into her own. not through vengeance, but through the quiet power of her authenticity. The donor's pledges, the journalist's notes, the warmth of strangers' smiles had lit a fire within her, one that no ultimatum could extinguish. But as she directed her team to pack the last crates, the weight of the mansion's shadow lingered. Elizabeth's parting words, "Don't mistake applause for belonging," had been a final jab, but Santa stood taller now, her roots too deep to be uprooted. Inside, the ballroom was emptying, its chandeliers dimming as guests departed, their chatter filled with praise for Sana's kitchen. James lingered at the edge, his eyes tracing the path Sana had walked, her presence a beacon he'd failed to shield. His fingers brushed his chin, a nervous tick that betrayed the storm within. He approached her as she stacked trays, his voice low, trembling with a sincerity he'd rarely shown. "Sana, I was wrong," he said, his words heavy with regret. "I let you go. I let her win." Sana paused, her hands steady on a crate, her gaze meeting his. "You didn't let her win, James," she said, her voice calm but piercing. "You let me go, and that fire you couldn't protect now warms others." Her words weren't cruel, but they were final, a door closing on a chapter she'd outgrown. James's shoulders slumped, his eyes glistening, but he nodded, accepting the truth he'd avoided too long. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but Sana was already turning away, her focus on her team, their laughter a stark contrast to the mansion's sterile hush. She didn't look back, her steps light but resolute, her apron dusted with the spices of a life reclaimed. As she stepped into the night, Mr. Thompson caught her at the door, his nod warm with pride. "You've built something real," he said, his voice a quiet anchor. "Don't stop." Sana smiled, tucking his words beside the critic's card that had sparked her rise. The city awaited her, and she was ready. Inside, Elizabeth stood alone in the ballroom, a glass of wine cradled in her hand, the ruby ring on her finger glinting like a fading ember. The tables were cleared, the decorations pristine, but the room felt hollow, its grandeur a mask for her isolation. She'd won the battle. Sana was gone, her control intact, but the victory tasted like ash. James had slipped away after his apology, his absence a silent rebellion. She moved to the study where a recipe card Sana had left behind lay on the desk, its edges worn, its handwriting vibrant with notes on hibiscus and tamarind. Elizabeth's fingers traced the card, a flicker of doubt softening her gaze. Thompson entered, his presence steady as ever. "Your husband was a dreamer once," he said softly. "He'd have loved her fire." Elizabeth's lips parted, but no words came, only a quiet ache she refused to name. Across town, Sana stood on a stage at the Women Who Build Summit, a microphone in hand, her voice clear and assured. The room was packed, faces turned toward her, drawn by her story of turning pain into purpose. "They told me to shrink," she said, her words resonating, "but I built something bigger than their fear." Behind her, the logo for Sana's kitchen flashed, now expanding to 8 cities, 3 countries, a testament to her vision. The audience rose, their applause a wave that carried her forward. A headline the next morning would call her "From Daughter-in-Law to Industry Leader." But Sana didn't need the words. She felt them in every hand she shook, every plate she served. Back at the mansion, Elizabeth sat at the breakfast table, the recipe card still in her hand. The housekeeper hovered, waiting for instructions, but none came. The eggs were perfect, the coffee hot, but the room was cold, the silence deafening. James had moved out days ago, leaving a note. "I need to find peace, Mother." He hadn't said Sana's name, but he didn't need to. The mansion, once her kingdom, was now a mausoleum, its polished surfaces reflecting nothing but loss. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the card, its ink a reminder of the woman she'd pushed away. Outside, the lawn was flawless, but the absence of Sana's garden, of her laughter, her warmth, left a void no wealth could fill. Sana, meanwhile, stood on her apartment's balcony, sipping hibiscus tea, the city's lights stretching before her. Her phone buzzed, a message from a new client, then another from a community center begging for her classes. She smiled, her heart full, not of vengeance but of purpose. The mansion was a memory now, its walls too small for her dreams. Elizabeth had kept her legacy, but it was empty, a crown without a kingdom. Sanaa had built her own, not with control, but with connection, and its light would only grow brighter. Sanaa's story is a spark in the dark, a reminder that true legacy is built not on control, but on the courage to stand in your own light. What did her journey stir in you? Did it ignite a memory, a dream, or a resolve to carve your own path? Share your thoughts. Your voice matters, and every story you tell adds to the tapestry of connection Sanaa fought for. Thank you for walking this road with her, for tasting the freedom in her flavors, and for witnessing the cost of a hollow crown. Come back soon, for the next tale might just be yours to tell.